Welcome everyone to another installment of our step-by-step series here at Decisions. We use these step-by-step videos to take a deeper look at steps in decisions and look at some of the functionality and implications of the steps. So today we're going to be taking a look at the collection filter steps. These steps are very powerful, but they do have some performance implications as well as organizational implications. We're going to start the video out by talking about the overall process and how these filters work, and then we're going to work our way towards how to organize and to prevent performance hits when utilizing these steps. So let's get started. All right, we're going to get started here in this flow that I have called Rule Collection Filter Basics, and that is exactly what we're going to talk about here in this part of the video. So in this flow, I just have a singular step, a rule collection filter. It can be easily found in the toolbox by searching. And what the rule collection filter is going to allow you to do is to take in a list of items. It can be strings, it can be dates, it can be complex types, it can be user-defined types, so if you have your own built-in data structure. And it's going to allow you to apply a rule to return what goes down true of that rule's path. You can return a list of the matches, you can return a list of the non-matches, and you can return two separate lists, matches and non-matches. And as I change this data to return, notice how my outputs on the right side will change. So I'll just say, I just want the matches, and non-matches will go away. And you can have named variables for those lists that go through this rule up here. So with this rule in its current iteration, we have entity starts with S. So we're just trying to find words or strings that start with the letter S. This entity is just a kind of placeholder for the individual string that goes through this rule. Kind of like a for each step uses the item variable, these rule collection filters are going to use entity. So we are taking in a list, but we are assessing each string individually. So for this example I've set up, every time that it goes through, the entity for the first time it goes through will be Afghanistan. The second time the entity goes through, it'll be Albania. Or if I run this flow, it'll be Audi, BMW, Buick, Cadillac, Chevrolet. Each of those will individually, at the time it goes through the rule, fill in that entity kind of placeholder in that rule. So as we go through, we can change the type. And you'll notice on here that as I go through here, the only options I really have are flow data and entity, even though I had an input into my main flow. We'll kind of talk about this here in a little bit later with some of the extended rule collection filter stuff. But if I expose flow data here, you'll notice that when I go back into that rule, I'm going to save it to make sure it kind of goes through. I will now have that input string as an option. But that is a list, so we don't necessarily want that. So, and we'll take another look at that in the kind of extended section right after this rule collection filters basics. So let's kind of see what it looks like as it goes through. We'll make some changes and we'll see how the data changes. So as you saw earlier, I have it set up to say entity starts with S. So as I run any of these unit tests, let's say vehicles, right? If I run this unit test, I will only have the inputs of all of the vehicles, but the output's only the ones that start with S. If I change this step to say return matches and non-matches, and I run that same process, you'll notice that my outputs, I have two. I have the output, which is all the S terms, and then I have non-matches, which will not contain any S terms at all. So you kind of have both sides of the coin on that one. So that is a simple look at rule collection filter. You can change the rule very easily. You can populate some of this stuff dynamically, which we'll show here in a second in the extended section, but I can easily just change this to A or add additional rules. But as I go through and debug, now when I run any of these vehicles, let's make sure I have some A's, Audi I do, you'll notice I still have that same huge input collection, but the only output I'm getting is Audi, and then non-matches is everything except for Audi. And again, I can do that for any of these. I can go states and take a look. Again, our inputs are going to be the whole list, and we have an output with just the states that start with the letter A, And the non-matches is the remainder of that initial list that goes through that we have just called input strings as a given input. So that's a quick look at the rule collection filter basics. All right, so let's take a look at how that rule collection filter might look when using a structure that is a user-defined type in Decisions. I have a fetch entities to get that data. I made this employee database structure and populated it with data ahead of time. So rather than just putting in a unit test and sending data through it, we're going to fetch all of the data associated with employee database. I have an image here with that information on it. With our rule collection filter, rather than just using a primitive type like a string or any of these other file data, decimal, we're actually going to parse through the employee database type using the entity results. A list of employee database comes out of our fetch entities, and that's going to be this data right here. So now that we've done that, we can write a rule that has multiple sections to it. So we can say entity position equals manager, or if they've been an employee that is their first 5 employees and they're in HR and they were born before 1990. And I know that's kind of an odd use case, but just to show that you can write more complex rules in there. Notice how all of these prefixes are entity, because once again, that is what the data is that goes through this rule as seen as. So the first record that's going to go through this is going to be Destiny Brooks, technical support, 6/1981. So entity position equals manager, entity employee number less than 5, position equals HR, date of birth less than 1990. And we can see if that will probably fill any of these positions. It probably will not, because they are not a manager, so it's not going to pass the top part of that rule, and they're not within the first 5 employees in the database. So when I run a debug, we will probably not see Destiny Brooks come out as a match, because we're only returning matches here. So if I debug, we'll notice coming out of fetch entities, we have all of this data that I have in the image, all just kind of here. Destiny Brooks, again, that information I just showed you, all going through. When we go to the rule collection filter, we can look at the inputs and outputs again. And again, it's just all 4 of those records, or 5 of those records. And it only is going to pass out the matches. Lucy White, because they're a manager. Molly Brooks, because they're a manager. And Adriana Flores, because they are a manager. Sydney Martin, they're in HR, but their employee number is less than 5, and they were born before 1990. We can look at how that data passes through the flows in this extended view of the debugger, so we can see why things might have passed or failed. But again, we're hitting that rule 5 or 6 times, which has some performance implications. So we'll talk about that a little bit later. So let's take a look at another use case and the functionality of the expose flow data option for the rule collection filter. It's shown right here. What expose flow data is going to allow you to do is to take data from your flow, either from forms or other steps, as well as the inputs to the flow themselves, and be able to map them into those rules. You'll notice that up top, we don't have the ability to adjust any inputs for this rule. And as you may have seen earlier in the video, by default, it's only going to give you entity and flow data as options. So because I exposed flow data here, I have the option for checkbox as well as starting letter, which are outputs of my form. So using outputs of the form, I'm able to populate what is being assessed by that rule. So let's take a look at what that looks like in its actual application. I have those same unit tests I set up earlier, such as states, vehicles, and countries, and I can run one of these. On this form, I can either choose to output all data, which will satisfy this checkbox is true and pass out all data, or if I run that same process and go with countries, I can choose to filter by a particular letter, like A, and then hit done. And because I populated that starting letter as A, it now passes out all of those that start with A. So again, the outputs of that are going to look something like this. Taking in all of the countries and outputting only the letter A that I populated dynamically from a form, just by passing that data out. So that's what expose flow data is going to do for you in the rule collection filter. So let's take a look at one more type of collection filter, just called the collection filter. So I've hopped on over to another flow I have here, and this is for the collection filter. So we just looked at the rule collection filter, and this one is called just collection filter. It's going to work in a real similar capacity, but rather than having to write rules, you can design a flow with rules in it. This could give you some advanced functionality if you wanted to perform calculations that you can't do in a rule. So say you wanted to give inputs and you wanted to figure out if the area of your given inputs, if it's a sphere, if it's less than a certain size, or for certain square footage, you can perform divide, multiply steps in this flow and feed that information and rules down into the paths. We have exclude from collection and include in collection. But a thing to recognize is that we're only going to get the matches with this step. Again, we have that same kind of entity dropdown to represent each item that individually goes through this flow. And we just have it as a length greater than 6. So just to show you kind of how it works, again, it's a real similar process. If I go to debug that same process, I have those same unit tests. I can just find vehicles with more than 6 characters in their name. We have the input collection of all of our vehicles, and then our filtered array is just going to be all the vehicles that have more than 6 characters in them. So again, just another way to filter data. All right, so let's now move on to the long-awaited performance implications as well as organizational implications that you might have with the rule collection filter. It seems like a relatively straightforward step, but the most important thing for you to realize is that with these rule collection filters or with the collection filter, it is going to be, in addition to the step it hits, it's also going to be hitting a rule or a flow that has to be stored somewhere. So for this particular flow, expose flow data with a filter, the rule that's in it is called rule collection filter basics underscore rule collection filter step 1 rule parentheses 1. And that is not going to be seen by default in your folder structure in decisions. So if I close out of this, we're not going to find that rule in any of these areas. So here in the rules, there are no rules. If you want to find those rules or flows, they can be located by going to folder view, expanding this folder data, changing all folder entities to all folder items with hidden. And you'll see now that all of those rules and flows that are associated with either the rule collection filter or just the collection filter are a part of this project. So you got to imagine that when a piece of data goes through that step, it's not really hitting one step. It's hitting one step and a flow, or it's hitting one step and a rule. As well as when you choose to move some of these elements to another project, you'll have some disconnected issues with the rules and flows that exist with it unless you choose to move those as well. All right, so let's take a look at what happens when we try and move some of these flows that contain rule collection filters or a collection filter. I can try and move this rule collection filter basics. Before we do that, let's figure out what the name of this subflow is. We have it named as rule collection filter basics rule collection filter step 1 rule up here. So if I try and move this to a different project, let's just say we'll move it to the file directory demonstration. And we'll just move it right now. The entity was moved successfully. But let's see what it looks like on the other side. Rule collection filter basics. And if you look up top, it did not move that flow with it. It is still in the project called rule collection filter, rule collection filter. But if I go to take this project and move it into repo or into prod, it's not going to move that rule with it. So you got to remember that that rule or that flow that is associated with the collection filter or the rule collection filter needs to be moved when you move the parent flow that contains it. So in overview, hopefully you can see how the rule collection filter is a really useful tool for parsing through data. You can expose flow data to get more and more options for your rule. You can create custom rules or custom flows to parse through that data. You can return matches, non-matches, or a list of the matches and the non-matches. That is all I have for you today. Thank you very much.